Hi everyone, we're Group 10 and our assigned justice view was Christian virtue ethics on social justice. I'm Ashton Chaco and I'm going to be talking about what virtue ethics is as well as some of the anticipated counter-arguments. So what is virtue ethics? Virtue ethics began in classical philosophy like we learned about, with Plato teaching that the human soul is threefold with the three virtues that govern the aspects of a human being, with courage being the virtue of the spirit, temperance the virtue for appetite, and prudence the virtue of intellect, and with the virtue of justice being above these three, which ensures the proper ordering of the other virtues. And this talks about this on page 142 of the book. So virtue is who we are and what sort of life we should be living. This could lead to some conflicting views since different people groups could consider themselves virtuous but be isolated from society. Also, this brings up that different cultural norms are different, and so virtues that are held within one community could not be held in another community. There's a relationship between virtues and practices as practices shape virtue, so kind of like what I was saying, different communities have different virtues. Point Loma has different virtues than, say, SDSU has different virtues. So virtues are required for achieving the good telos of life is what virtue ethicists would argue. So this was taken and applied to the Christian tradition and is different from Plato and Aristotle's approach, as Christians use stories to teach Christian virtue. So a virtue ethicist would ask what the telos of a truly just justice system is, and that it must include more than just prosecuting and punishing guilty individuals. So it must also have a virtuous reform of criminals that can include reconciliation to those that they've actually wronged, since virtue ethics focuses on how crimes also can tear apart relationships within society. So specifically Christian virtue ethics, they really value having people together in a community. So the ultimate goal is to lean towards what is best in us for the good, that we were created to build communities where flourishing is possible. So some of the possible critiques. So often critics say that virtue ethics is oppressive since it can create this isolation. It may be labeled as communitarianism, although the author states that this is not the case and that it's much different. The author argues that this is that it's betraying the basic understanding. It's a misunderstanding. It may be seen as too individualistic as it addresses each individual rather than society as a whole, since each person has different virtues, so people can worry that it's more focused in best for an individual person rather than a society as a whole. But the author says that virtue overcomes the individualism of modern ethics, as moral agency is not only to be given to individuals but also can be applied to communities. So also people can say that it is too internal and only addresses the moral inclinations and aptitudes, not actual praxis. And it is not tradition as in traditional, but rather established status quo as the best reality. So the author argues that the cardinal virtue of wisdom includes practical wisdom, and that virtues are always about doing and not only about contemplation. This is on page 154.
Hi, my name is Savannah, and I will be talking about how virtue ethics can guide us through homelessness. So basically, to begin, a virtue ethicist would ask, what is the telos, end goal, of a society in which the homeless are all housed? The telos in virtue ethics is basically a life which promotes the flourishing of all, individually and collectively, but you can't flourish collectively until you also are flourishing individually. It's kind of like a mutually influential balance. So virtue ethicists would consider homelessness to be a blockade towards the flourishing of life on a societal level, and thus it is an issue that we should work towards solving by adjusting our own lens of morality on an individual level. And we can do this through the application of the virtue of justice, which is recognized in the virtue ethics chapter as the sum of all virtues. So also, to help work towards a solution, we must each become the kind of person that supports individuals such as the homeless through our own ongoing virtuous action in our own lives. But a virtue is not just a thing to aspire towards, it's our actions, and they can only be cultivated through habits which affirm the good. It's not like a one-time thing. So basically, like, virtue ethicists believe if I flourish, then you can flourish as well. And as a means to accomplish the end goal of our society flourishing, we must all engage in a life which values virtues, which is the mean between virtues and vices, which we kind of talked about earlier in the semester. And then, so a solution that virtue ethicists might seek is basically one which begins on an internalized level, which, although is a critique of virtue ethics, is also, I think, not a bad thing, because by beginning, we have to begin to end homelessness somewhere, and we might as well begin the end of it in our own communities. And so, due to homelessness being a worldwide issue, if we can combat it on a smaller scale, if we all do this, then collectively we can make a change and seek justice. But a potential solution might be implementing more opportunities for more affordable housing in our communities, since there's such a disparity between the wealthy and the impoverished. And lastly, they would believe that the collective change on a smaller and individual scale, as I said a second ago, that virtue ethics calls for in its nature, would contribute towards the global and nationwide fight towards homelessness. So that would inch us closer to flourishing on an individual, community, and collective nationwide level. So that's virtue ethics in homelessness.
Hey, my name is Carly, and today I'm going to be closing us out on the topic of Christian virtue ethics and on social justice. So, some virtue ethics believe that the concept of virtue can be too individualistic. This book addresses how this can affect each person's character, and instead of social and political structures and political realities. We realize that some critics insist that virtue is a concept which is an internal proposition, and this only addresses moral tendencies and talents, but not actual praxis. So the book states that the argument of critics has misunderstood virtue traditions, and we dive deeper in that towards the end of the chapter. The cardinal virtue of wisdom includes practical wisdom, and the virtues are always about doing and not only contemplation or formation. Something interesting that the book talked about was tradition, and how there's a simple fundamental misunderstanding about tradition and what the meaning of tradition is. So this book had mentioned that when one speaks about tradition, it's bringing up the good old days, and the misunderstanding is the debate that change is bad and critical theories like feminism and liberation are necessarily threatening. The chapter also talks about virtue and other approaches to justice. It talks a lot about libertarianism and how it is more about freedom of the individual than the common good of society. This all led to how feminism and liberation represented both kinds of challenges to some degree, and the claims of oppressed and marginal people arose in political discards outside Christianity, and this all brought external challenges to Christian tradition. The book also talks a lot about a more justice system and what that looks like. So, and announced the question of what is the telos of a truly justice system, and this question is what most ethicists would start by asking. Because justice as a virtue is not punctiliar, it's not only something that happens or fails at a certain point in a time of like a process of prosecuting or sentencing, but instead it is something that can be throughout communities and societies, from prevention and the roots of crime. And so, like, this all led me to two questions that I have brought to you guys, such as, does our vision of social justice make one way of seeing something the only way of seeing something? And the second question being, what is the core desire of virtue?